Good morning. It is so good to see you. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. And while you're turning there, I've got a picture I want to show you. When it comes to historical landmarks, most of you will recognize this. This is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, located in Pisa, Italy. Almost everybody's kind of familiar with this. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that a couple hours north of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, there is another tower located right in the heart of Bologna, Italy, that's actually leaning more than the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I've got a picture of it. It's called the Tower of Garancinda. Just so you know what you're looking at, the tall tower is not the one that's leaning. It's the one next to it. So you can kind of see how off-center it is in comparison to its sort of twin tower there. The construction started in 1109, back in the 12th century, but it made the news a couple weeks ago when a group of engineers now say they think the tower is in danger of collapsing, which if you look at that is going to cause all sorts of complications because it's located right in the heart of the city and it's surrounded by other historic buildings. Historians say that because of the weight of the tower, and because of a shift in the foundation, it's been leaning almost since the moment it was completed, but it started to lean more in recent years, which has prompted a group of engineers to start a multi-decade, multi-million-dollar renovation project in which they hope to stabilize the tower and protect the buildings around it. In 2022, engineers placed a series of alarms all over the tower that would let them know if it was shifting. And sure enough, in October of last year, 2023, those alarms started sounding, which let them know if they're going to do something, they have to do it pretty quickly. In a press conference announcing the project, the mayor of Bologna put it this way. He said, "We inherited a situation that over the centuries has considerably worsened." He then said this, "This isn't just about saving a heritage site. It also has a very strong symbolic value." Now, with that in mind, we're in week 3 of the series that we're calling The Week the World Turned. We've been looking at the last week of Jesus' life on earth. And over the last 2 weeks, if you've been with us, we've looked at 2 events that are very strong in symbolic value. First, on the Sunday, the first Sunday of the Passover festival, Jesus comes in riding on the back of a donkey. We call that the triumphal entry. 24 hours later, on that Monday, he goes into the temple where he cleanses the temple. But there was something else that happened on that Monday that I intentionally skipped over last week because honestly, when you read the story, it doesn't come into its full significance until the next day on Tuesday. 3 of the 4 gospel writers tell us that as Jesus and his disciples were entering into Jerusalem on Monday, that Jesus walked up to a fig tree. I've got a picture of what this might have looked like. Some of you are familiar with this. It says that even though the fig tree was in season, there was no fruit on the tree. And it says at that particular moment, Jesus was hungry. It then says that Jesus cursed the fig tree. Now make sure you catch that. He cursed the fig tree. He didn't curse at the fig tree, like some of us probably would have done, right? And it says nobody really knew what to think of that until the next day. They're going back in Jerusalem, and the disciples come across this same fig tree, and now it's completely dead. And on the surface, it seems like one of those weird stories. You're trying to make sense of this, but like almost everything that happened during that final week of Jesus' life, the symbolism ran much deeper than anybody could have ever realized. Just like the story that we looked at last week, when Jesus went in and cleansed the temple, this is not a story about Jesus losing his temper and doing something that you wish you could do. Instead, what he did is he foreshadows what's about to happen to Israel. So if you're keeping track, here's the first thing I want you to catch today. Jesus' cursing of the fig tree foreshadowed God's judgment on Israel. Almost every nation on the earth has some sort of national symbol that they use to represent their nation. Sometimes it's an animal, other times it's a plant. So, for example, in the United States, our national symbol is the bald eagle. If you go to Canada, their national symbol is a maple leaf. Not to be outdone, Russia has a two-headed golden eagle that they use. If we were going to create one for Monticello, it might be a pool hall burger. Just put a drawing of a pool hall burger. I was preaching out of town earlier this week, and when it was over, this guy came up to me. He said, "I'd really like to come to Monticello and hear you preach." I said, "Well, you should come." And he said, "I'm only coming on days that the pool hall is open." And I said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you then, man. So if you got an answer to that, let me know, and I'll call him." Today, Israel uses the Star of David as their national symbol. But if you go back to the Old Testament, whenever the prophets referenced Israel, they often referred to it as a fig tree. And the reason for that is because fig trees grow in that part of the world, so it made sense. And so when Jesus walks upon this fig tree, that even though it's in season, is bearing no fruit, he's not just reacting in anger. It's not like he's just losing his temper. Instead, he's creating an unmistakable object lesson of what's about to happen to the nation of Israel. And so early on that Tuesday morning, as Jesus and his disciples re-enter Jerusalem and they go back to the temple where all the crazy stuff happened the day before, his disciples see this fig tree and they have to start sensing that there's something big that's about to go down. In Luke's gospel, Luke's telling the story, he tells us that during the final week of Jesus' life, from Monday until his arrest on that Thursday evening, he spent the biggest part of each day inside the temple. Here's how he says in Luke 21. Each day, Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives, and all the people came early in the morning to hear him at the temple. So you can imagine, after the chaotic scene the day before where Jesus came in and cleansed the temple, there's a huge crowd of people waiting for him to come back on that Tuesday morning. But it's not just the people that are waiting for him, it's the religious leaders. And they're ready for a showdown. So the first thing they do when Jesus arrives on Tuesday morning is they question him. They want to know what gives him the right to do what he's been doing. So Jesus, being the genius that he was, turns it back on them. He asks them a question that they can't answer, and then he spends the rest of the day telling stories, answering questions, and teaching the people who had assembled in a way that they had never heard before. If you go back and read through the Gospels, you read about this Tuesday during the last week of Jesus' life. It's amazing how many different stories he told. Like, we could do a whole series just on what Jesus talked about on that Tuesday morning. But there's one story in particular that I think captures and sort of summarizes the essence of everything he taught that day. It's called the parable of the tenants, or sometimes you'll hear it called the parable of the vineyard. And the reason Jesus chose a vineyard is because everybody in that context would have understood what he was talking about. So what we're going to do is just read the story, and then we'll unpack it just a bit. Mark chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. Jesus opens this story by describing a scene that everybody could relate to. So you have this wealthy landowner who purchases a piece of property. He prepares the property, and then he leaves, and he comes to some sort of agreement for somebody else to actually farm the property and raise the crop. And then at the end of the day, he'll get a certain percentage, usually 25 or 30%. Some of you are part of similar arrangements today. And one of the things that's so interesting, though, about this property that Jesus described is is how nice it seems to be. It's got a wall around it. It's got a wine press that's actually there on the property. It's even got a watchtower so that somebody can watch over the property. So this is not like some forgotten farm, back in the woods. This is a show place. But then you get to verse 3, and Jesus describes this plot twist. It's the kind of plot twist that would have caused everybody to lean forward in anticipation of what's going to happen. It comes time for them to pay the agreed upon percentage back to the landowner. And it says the owner sends one of his managers or one of his servants, and the tenants, instead of paying the fee, they beat him up and they send him away empty-handed. Same thing happens to the second servant. And then when you get to verse 5, it says the violence reaches a new level, and they actually kill the third servant. Rather than just beating him up, they take it that far and they kill him. But even that's not the end of it, because Jesus said there's these other servants that come. The owner's not going to give up quite so easily, so he sends this long line of servants. And verse 5 says, some of them they beat up, and some of them they killed. And then when you get to verse 6, the owner decides that instead of sending another servant, he's going to send his son. And he thinks, surely they're not going to kill my son. And then unthinkably, that's what they do. They murder the son of the owner. One of the things I found interesting during the press conference, I went back and watched at least the English subtitles when they announced this project to save the Garincinda Towers, that the engineers spent a lot of their time explaining that it was not, the leaning of the tower was not caused by just one thing. It was a combination of several different things. It's the weight of the tower, the erosion of the soil, the disintegration of the stones, the effects of flooding. All of that has created this perfect storm where they know that tower is eventually going to collapse if something dramatic isn't done. The same thing is true of God's judgment on Israel. When you go back and you read through their story, you discover it wasn't caused by just one thing. Instead, there's a combination of things that come together. And as you look at this story, and that's really what this story is about, he's explaining what just happened with the fig tree. Jesus talks about 3 deadly mistakes that the people of Israel made that eventually led to their collapse. And one of the things that's so cool about this story is that each of these mistakes is seen within the context of the relationships that are described in the story. For example, you see the first mistake in the relationship between the tenants and the owner. And here's the mistake they make. The tenants assumed that the owner's silence meant his absence. Now, historians tell us in the ancient world it wasn't unusual for a wealthy landowner to leave for an extended period of time. So that would give him an opportunity to go other places, do other things, take care of other business. That also gave the tenant farmer the opportunity to manage the farm without having the owner breathing down his neck and micromanaging his decisions. And in most instances, the only time the landowners and the tenants would ever communicate was when it came time to settle up at the end of the harvest season. But in this story, the mistake the tenants made is that they assumed, because they hadn't heard from the owner in a while, that he wasn't paying attention. They mistook his silence for his absence. So later in the story, Jesus indicates that they may have even thought he was dead. And so what happened is, the longer this went on, the longer they didn't hear from the owner, the more they began to act not like tenants, but like owners. You ever done that? You ever made the mistake of acting as if you're the owner and not just a tenant? I have. For the Jewish religious leaders, which is who this story is primarily about, at some point they started to believe that all of that stuff that was happening in the temple and all of that stuff in their religion was mostly about them. It was about protecting their position, maintaining their power over the people, instead of helping people who were far from God experience a life-changing moment with God. Now for us, it might look different, but we've all done some version of the same thing. And here's what we normally do. We make the mistake of looking at our bank accounts, our IRAs, our property holdings, our houses, our boats, our farms, our toys, our clothes, and cars, and we believe that somehow all of that belongs to us, that we're the owners, when the Bible makes it clear that God owns everything. There's nothing that you've ever seen that God doesn't own. There's nothing that you have in your possession that God doesn't own. Now, your name might be on the paperwork, but ultimately it's God who owns everything. It's also God to whom we will one day give an account of what we did with what He gave us. That leads to the second deadly mistake, and this one happens within the relationship between the tenants and the messengers, and that's that the tenants refuse to listen to the messengers. So throughout this story, the owner sends a series of messengers to get the attention of the tenants, and in each of those instances, rather than receiving the message, rather than submitting to the authority of the owner, what do? They refused to listen. Again, in this instance, he's primarily talking about Israel's response to the prophets that God had sent. You go back to the Old Testament, Israel would get off track, God would send a prophet, and more often than not, what did they do? They rejected the prophet. They refused to listen. Occasionally, they would make a few temporary adjustments, but more often than not, they would just continue right on doing whatever it is they were doing. They did what the tenants in this story did. The owner would send a messenger, they would ignore the message and continue down the same path they were on. But there's something else they do here that's easy to miss if you read the story too fast. And that's that each time the owner sends a new messenger to confront them, there is an escalation that takes place in their refusal to listen to the truth. For example, here's what I mean. The owner says that he sent the first messenger, and what do? It says they beat him up and they sent him away. So he sends a second messenger, and this time, instead of just roughing him up, it says they hit him on the head and they treated him shamefully, which is an escalation. Then you get to the third messenger, and what do to him? It says they kill him. And so the implication is the more messengers he sent, the more intense the beatings got, the more frequent the murders got. It all escalates every time they get confronted with something that they don't want to hear. And the question is, why are they reacting so violently? In our world, you know how this works. This is something for the lawyers to figure out. We'll talk a big game, but most of us are not going to kill people or kill multiple people over a contract dispute or a property disagreement. But in this story that Jesus told, these dudes kill multiple people over a land dispute. So why would they do that? And the reason they do that, and some of us have experienced this in our own lives, and I know we don't like to talk about it, is that whenever you refuse to listen to the truth, there's always an escalation that follows. And here's how you know it's happening. Somebody confronts you about something, and instead of listening, now you're angry. And if that continues on, there comes a point where not only do you refuse to listen to the truth, you can actually become hostile towards the truth. Some of you have experienced that. Some of you have people in your family that are hostile toward the truth. And that brings us to the last mistake you see in this, and it's the relationship between the tenants and the son of the owner, and that's that the tenants rejected the son. I want you to listen to this part of the story again, verse 6. He, talking about the owner, had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, they will respect my son. But the tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. It's interesting, verse 7, as these tenants are talking to one another, they use the word heir instead of son. And I think that goes back to that first point about they mistook the owner's silence for his absence. And it almost reads as if they think the owner is now dead. Like the owner's disappeared, and this is the only heir that we know about. And so if we can get rid of this guy, maybe we can just sort of take possession of land and everything will fall in our lap. And underneath all of their scheming, though, there's something else that I think explains this whole story. What was it? What was it these guys wanted? They wanted what all of us want. They wanted control. They wanted power. They wanted possession. They wanted wealth. I mean, after spending their lives as tenants, they now wanted to be the owners. And that's the same disease that's infected all of us. That's the human condition. You go back to Genesis 3, it was that same desire that caused Adam and Eve to break the one rule they'd been given and eat the forbidden fruit. And we read that story and we think, why would they do that? They did it because they wanted to be like God. They were not content just to be tenants. They wanted to be the owners. And so just like we do, and just like the tenants in this story did, they refused to listen to the owner. They refused to listen to the warning. They went ahead and they did what they wanted to do anyway. And the result is that the entire world was thrown into chaos. And it's still there. When you get to verse 9, after concluding this story, Jesus looks at this audience that's assembled around him, and he asked them a question, and then he made a statement that would have stopped them in their tracks. Check this out, verse 9. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this passage of Scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Then the chief priest, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. One of the things I love about Jesus, like his teaching's always so profound, but it's rarely complicated. Like you read this story, it's easy to see what he's talking about. The Jewish religious leaders are the wicked tenants who time and time again have refused to listen to the prophets sent by God. And now God has sent his one and only Son in this last-ditch effort to call the people back to himself. And rather than receiving him and submitting his authority, what are they doing? They're plotting to kill him. And then to make sure they don't miss the significance of what they're about to do, Jesus points them back to this famous messianic psalm, Psalm 118, that all of them had memorized and yet somehow had failed to understand. And the key word in verse 10 is the word cornerstone. Jesus said, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, in masonry construction, the cornerstone is the stone that joins two walls together. And because of its significance, it's always the first stone that's laid. And every stone that's laid after the cornerstone is laid in reference to the cornerstone, meaning everything has to line up with the cornerstone. It's the cornerstone that orients the entire building and ensures the integrity of the structure. And if for some reason things don't line up, or if something happens to that cornerstone and it collapses, then everything that's built on top of it also collapses. A lot of times, whenever you read about an old building that falls down, it's because something happened to the cornerstone, which in turn caused the building to collapse. And that's exactly what Jesus is trying to drive home to these religious leaders. He wants them to know that this stone that they were choosing to reject is the fulfillment or the cornerstone upon which their entire culture has been built. And because they're rejecting the cornerstone, all they have to look forward to now is an imminent collapse. Now you hear that and you think, okay, I get all that from a historical perspective, but what in the world does that have to do with me? And the answer is, has everything to do with you. Because the same thing that was true of the people listening to Jesus teach in the temple on that last Tuesday of his earthly life is also true for us. That's why when you turn to Luke 20, Luke tells the same story. and he includes another little statement that Jesus made that for some reason Mark left out. Here's what Luke said. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. Here's the big idea, the key truth that Jesus is driving home. Without the right cornerstone, life eventually collapses. Without the right cornerstone, life eventually collapses. That was true for the people who traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, who gathered at the temple that morning. It's also true for us who sit here in March of 2024. All of us, just like Jesus said, we're in the process of building our lives on some kind of foundation. For a lot of us, the cornerstone that we're trying to build on is our careers and our jobs. And so everything we do is done in service to that job. It's about getting that promotion, securing that next big deal, getting that fat raise. For others, we've allowed our net worth to become our cornerstone. So if things are good, everything feels pretty good, we feel pretty confident. The market dips, something takes a bad turn, all of a sudden we feel a little bit threatened. For some people, it's sports. For other people, it's some hobby. For some people, it's their physical appearance or their kids or their position in the community or a certain relationship that they're sure is going to carry them into the end. And I don't know what it might be for you, but I can tell you this. If you choose to build your life on any other foundation than your relationship with Jesus Christ, eventually it's going to collapse. And you already know that's true because you've seen it happen to other people. You just don't like to think about it. One day, that job that you work so hard to get and then you invest so much of yourself into is going to be somebody else's. And one day, hard as it is to believe, you're going to take your last breath and your heart is going to beat for the last time. And in that moment, whatever money is left in those accounts that you're so obsessed with is going to be somebody else's. One day, your kid is going to play his or her last game. And then they're going to move out of your house for the last time. And you're going to be pushed out of that position of authority that you worked so hard to get. And as painful as it is to hear, one day you're going to look in the mirror and you're going to think, what happened to me? I don't look anything like I remember looking. And the tragic mistake that so many of us make is that we choose to build our lives on foundations that we know are temporary, and then we act surprised when they collapse. The challenge, though, is that you rarely know when the collapse is coming. You might have a hint, but you really never know. I've got one last picture I want to show you. Back in November, after the press conference announcing this project to save the Garisenda Tower, the Guardian magazine sent a reporter to Bologna, Italy, to interview people who live in the area. And as they were conducting these interviews, it was interesting that the people they interviewed fell into one of two camps. First, there were several people they interviewed, some of whom actually are involved, like directly involved in the project, who say that while they believe the tower may eventually collapse, they think it'll still be another 10 or 20 years before it actually comes down. And keep in mind, some of these people literally work for the engineers who have said that the tower itself is in inescapably critical condition. But even knowing that, there's a part of them that can't really imagine that it's all going to come crashing down. And then there were people who live like literally within sight of the tower, some of whom live like when the sun hits right, they live in the shadow of the tower, and they can watch as that shadow subtly inches forward, who really don't believe the tower's in any danger of collapsing at all. One person told the reporter, said, "We're not afraid at all. Obviously, they need to investigate, but I don't really believe the tower is going to fall down." Can I just tell you, when it all comes crashing down, it doesn't matter what you believe. It's going to crash whether you believe it's possible or not. And I was reading this story, it occurred to me. That's what the Jewish religious leaders did. All the evidence is right in front of them, and they refused to see it. They've refused to believe that a collapse was possible until the moment it all collapsed around them. That's also the same thing that a lot of us do. We can feel the ground shifting. We can hear the alarms. We know that something is moving, and yet we do our best to ignore it and to pretend it's not happening. So here's the question. How do you avoid a collapse? You do the opposite of what they did. Rather than refusing to listen to the truth, you submit yourself to the authority of God's word. Rather than rejecting the Son, you place yourself under the authority of Him. You build your life on the cornerstone that they rejected. That's the only thing you can do that can ensure you against a collapse. And with that in mind, I want you to stand with me. If you're here this morning and you're ready to start building your life on the stone that they rejected, we'd love to help you do that. David's going to be here. John's here. If you need to talk with somebody, you need to pray with someone, maybe you have questions you'd like to ask, maybe you're ready to put your trust in Christ, be baptized into Christ, or join our church family, we'd love to help you navigate that process. Whatever you need to do, meet us on this front row. We'll walk you through it.